Hello, and welcome back to another Robin Hood moment. 3 years ago, during the summer of 2020, the nation experienced an overdue reckoning on how race shapes every aspect of our society, including philanthropy. At the same time, new research had just been published showing a lack of philanthropic investment in organizations led by people of color. Over the last 2 decades, only 1 out of every $10 went to nonprofits with leaders of color, and that stands in stark contrast to data for New York City, where 4 out of 5 people living in poverty are people of color. It was in that moment that the Power Fund came to be, an initiative to invest in nonprofit leaders of color who run organizations that are on the front lines fighting poverty in New York City. Since its launch, the Power Fund has strengthened how we fight poverty as an organization. Over 18 months, Robin Hood has invested nearly $11 million in 23 New York City nonprofit leaders of color. I'm Crystal Cooper, Deputy Director of Communications at Robin Hood, and today we're chatting all things Power Fund with Hana Haile-Mariam, Director of Partnerships and Initiatives at Robin Hood. Welcome to the podcast, Hana. Thank you, Crystal. Excited to be here. Great. So, Hana, you were part of the original Robin Hood team that came up with and launched the Power Fund. Take us back to summer of 2020. What caused us to take action to elevate nonprofit leaders of color, and what were the goals of the Power Fund?
Yes, absolutely. So I feel like you set it up really well. But, in 2020, we all just sat, I think, in horror as we watched for 9 minutes and 29 seconds as George Floyd was murdered on national television. And there was really this national moment of racial reckoning and really folks thinking about what was their role in perpetuating racial inequity. Similarly, around that time in May, just a month before of 2020, Echoing Green and Bridgespan released a report around disparities in philanthropic funding. And the fact that, as you stated, while really philanthropic funding had increased over 400% in the last 10 years, only 10% of that went to leaders of color. And if you drill down even deeper in that, in many reports, you'll see, less than 1% of that went to females that ran organizations that were leaders of color. And so I think Robin Hood was thinking really about what's our role in that discrepancy. And so we did a lot of kind of internal reflection and looking at, the fact that, as you stated, New York City and the folks that are living in poverty, over 80% of folks living in poverty are people of color. And was our grant-making portfolio really representing the communities that we look to service? And while we were higher than kind of the national average of philanthropy, what the grants that philanthropies are giving out to leaders of color, it wasn't enough. And so we really launched the Power Fund with the sole goal of increasing the diversity of our grant-making portfolio and funding leaders of color that we had never funded before.
So when we examined our own grant-making through a more critical eye, what did we end up finding?
Yeah, it's a good question. Many things, actually. And I think it was actually such a great exercise for everyone on our program team, our development team, policy team. And really 3 main things come to mind. One is sourcing. And so we see this in many different industries, but your networks are critically important to getting in the door. So how do you really get in the door if you can't find the door? Is kind of how I would phrase it. And I think we realized that we had to get more creative in looking for organizations.
And by people of color.
And by people of color, yeah. And also just expanding our networks. Can we talk to other philanthropies who are doing this super well? We have some of these networks that we just weren't tapping. We got maybe a little bit used to business as usual, and I think we realized we had to get creative. So that was one. So really looking at how are we sourcing organizations and getting creative. The second is around metrics and reporting. I think in that Echoing Green and Bridgespan report, you'll see there's a lot of bias around metrics and reporting as well. I think some philanthropies require, ourselves included, that we are really rigorous. Yeah, it's wildly rigorous. And I think that in itself was cutting out kind of leaders of color after a first conversation. We really look towards outcomes data. And so many of these leaders of color, these executive directors, are both the development directors, they are doing the reports, they are communications, or everything. And so how can you really even have a long-standing conversation or numerous conversations if you're not getting the metrics we're requiring, and they just don't have the capacity to do that? So that was something we really had to be reflective on. And we found actually through our process that there were organizations we had passed on before because of that we then actually did end up funding through the Power Fund. So that was one thing, a big one for us. And similar with reporting, just we require a lot of reporting, and I think holistically actually went back and looked at what we're requiring, why, and how we can make it easier. And then finally, I would say this is more so when someone is getting close to being funded, but you're still in the interview process. Were we over-defining how people could use their funds? So many philanthropies and so many folks want to say, I know better than you as to how I want my money directed. But so many folks just need general operating support. They just need the flexibility to hire people, the flexibility to do what they know best.
You can't even begin to do your mission at all, much less do it well.
Totally.
Without even the people.
Totally.
Infrastructure.
Critically important. And so that was one. And then similarly in that vein, contract goals, just ensuring that you're having conversations and really setting people up for success before you even get in a relationship. And so really having an upfront conversation. So those were a few things that came about as we were doing a deep self-reflection and examination.
Wow. And how long did all of that take, out of curiosity?
We did it very fast. Yeah. So I think we knew that there was this moment where everyone was looking at, this national moment of racial reckoning. And so we wanted to ensure that we were getting things done fast when everyone was kind of looking and excited.
There was urgency.
And
Robin Hood, we know how to build things. We know how to convene. We know how to innovate. And so I'm assuming that we just, took that opportunity to really run with something.
Yeah.
So practically speaking, what is the Power Fund? What type of support do leaders of color who become our grantees receive?
Yes. So there's 3 pillars to the Power Fund. First is a meaningful investment. On average, Power Fund investments were around $400,000 to $450,000, which was large for Robin Hood. Also, a portion of that, as we had talked about earlier, definitely was general operating support for each organization, really giving them that flexibility to spend money as they see fit. The second was capacity building or management assistance supports for leaders of color. Something super specific that we tested with the Power Fund that we're now kind of rolling out more widely is the use of an organizational mapping tool where we had an organization come in and kind of do an assessment for these Power Fund leaders if they had capacity to do it, because that also requires them to have capacity, and give the results of that assessment directly to the Power Fund leader, which is huge because it prevents kind of that awkward power dynamic where a funder is funding an assessment, getting the results back, and then maybe making assumptions around the results that they're getting. So that was through the capacity building support. So they had a wide range, but that one in particular I found was super unique. And then finally, every single leader got $50,000 in self-directed leadership supports, which was huge. I think leaders and nonprofits generally don't get a lot of time to focus on their own professional development and needs, but specifically leaders of color, and specifically in this moment when they were just burdened with so much personally on top of work-wise, was a critical part of the Power Fund.
We invest in these leaders of color, obviously because there was a reckoning that they were sort of underrepresented in our grant making, but presumably also because they're doing work that is reaching the population that we care about.
Yeah.
Can you give me or our listeners a little flair for what different types of organizations were part of the Power Fund, sort of what were their missions and issue areas that they were conquering?
Yeah, it was across the gamut. I would say what was also super important for the in designing the Power Fund was that Robin Hood as a whole was involved. So it just wasn't 3 people on the program team or 1 person on the development team. That every single program member and every single policy team member and the development team,
they were touched by like every single vertical.
Yes, and touched by every vertical and policy vertical, et cetera. And so given that the diversity of the organizations we supported with mass, so we supported organizations across workforce supports, we supported organizations focused on the discrepancy in maternal health care, we supported charter schools, we supported organizations that focused on demographics we historically hadn't touched, like African immigrants, or touched as well, like African immigrants, diving deeper into the Asian population, fastest growing population in poverty in New York City, touching different geographic locations that we hadn't necessarily gotten deep in, like Coney Island, like Red Hook, parts of Queens, et cetera. And so it's a wildly diverse group. And it's actually skews women leaders of color, which also is something that I feel proud of, given the data.
Yeah, the data. That's something Robin Hood.
Exactly.
I love it. So you're kind of taking us in 2 different directions. One is how this funding actually transformed Robin Hood's fight and deepened our fight to end poverty. And the other is how the funding really helped our grantees better achieve their mission. Curious if you could speak a bit to both, like how has this deepened our fight, and then any examples of, grantees that were really able to take this funding and run with it.
Yes. So I think in terms of how it deepened our fight, I don't think that you can really talk about poverty without talking about race. And race is really one of the most reliable indicators of life outcomes across so many different areas, like life expectancy, academic achievement, so many health disparities. I think we've all seen recently, I just feel like the maternal health disparity has been everywhere. And New York City is like one of the top. Black women are 8 to 9 times more likely to die in childbirth. And so I think the mere acknowledgement that we had that there was more work to be done and putting a stake in the ground with the Power Fund was large, but putting the dollars to back it up, I think just in general deepened our fight. So, Robin Hood put in $10 million and then raised funds on top of that. And so I think that really has deepened our fight, just that acknowledgement and work. And then in terms of the organizations, I think so many of these we had such a wide range of organizations. Like I was talking about, we had first-time leaders of nonprofits. We had folks who had great, 20 years experience in the nonprofit world, folks who had worked in the city as deputy mayors, et cetera, that were running organizations. So just putting this cohort together in general, I would just really, really enjoyed. But I think having that Robin Hood brand name, that check mark that you kind of got through our process, helped to bring in more dollars for other folks and elevate kind of their presence. So whether it was, stories that we were doing and posting on our social media, whether it was even just elevating these leaders to our board network, our leadership council network, press releases, things like that, it's helped leaders get in the door with other philanthropies and other donors that historically it was just difficult.
Right. It increased their visibility and helped them find the door, going back to, what you mentioned in our opening.
Exactly.
So Hana, it sounds like this funding was truly transformational. There was so much good work that is now being done in communities, and we're reaching more communities experiencing poverty in New York City. We're very proud of the phase 1 of the Power Fund and are very excited that we're going to continue. Power Fund is not going away. So you, Hana, work on our development team and engage directly with donors day in and day out. What message do you have to donors at large about investing in leaders of color and continuing their commitment to the Power Fund?
Yes, absolutely. I would say, investing in leaders of color is a smart investment. You can't talk about large-scale population change without acknowledging race and all of our collective roles really in perpetuating racial inequity. 2020 wasn't just a moment, a place in which you can make, you can direct your funds, and that we walk the walk, not just talk the talk, is Robin Hood. If you're investing in New York City, come to us, invest in us, let us help you. More nationally, there are other resources as well, like seek help, reflect, understand your role. It will make a difference. You have to look at race when you're looking at addressing poverty. And we're so proud to be continuing our mission to do so.
I am proud to be here at Robin Hood, an organization that is really making real commitments to New Yorkers in poverty. Thank you to Hana for taking some time with us today, and to all of you for tuning in to another Robin Hood moment. To hear more news, interviews, and stories of impact, please visit us at robinhood.org.